are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
If you're ready to be a father and your baby keeps you up all night, you don't enjoy being up all night, but you feel very fatherly about having done it. I know I'm a dad because I was up all night with this kid screaming in my ear and spitting up on me, and he didn't care one way or another. But, these are the things that dads do, and I'm proud of it. If you don't have the maturity, you resent the kid keeping you up all night. The burden of the church becomes a resentment and an exhaustion as opposed to a joy. So these are some of the ways in which a lot of pastors feel like, I should be able to handle this. I've got the anointing. I should be able to handle this. But the third pressure is that our culture is a high performance culture. And so the expectation from almost everyone that walks in the church is, you better be performing at a higher level than the last church I visited, or I'm not going to hang out here. If you don't have some kind of solution to what do I do when people expect me to perform, which comes from maturity, the pressure to perform is so extreme.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. This week's episode is a continuation of our Leadership Under Pressure series. In this episode, Jay will be talking with Dr. Jim Wilder, author and chief neurotheologian of Life Model Works, a nonprofit working at the intersection of brain science and theology. Let's listen in.
Well, Dr. Wilder, I'm really grateful that you're joining us for our podcast. Really, really grateful.
Yeah, it's good to be here with you. And it seems like we have a lot in common from, a lot of different sources, and even now living relatively close together. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say, right now I'm maybe 15 minutes from you tops, but this is the way these things work. This is how you end up hanging out, meeting people. So,
but I'm really 2,000 feet higher than you. So what can I say?
That is true. That's true. Yeah. Well, I like to start where things start, which is always where you were born and where you grew up. That would be a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I was born actually in Colombia, South America, where my parents were there during a bloody, difficult time. And my mother was working with women and children ministry, and my dad just come back from World War II. And so I grew up with Spanish as my first language, though English wasn't very far behind. And living in the Andes and little villages and riding horses and all those kind of things.
Until how old?
Until I was 16, and then I came to the U.S. for school. But, we lived there before electricity, so it's kind of I've been in a whole bunch of different cultures, and it feels like I'm 150 years old in some ways, from all the different experiences I've had.
And you said it briefly, but just to make sure I heard you correctly, they were doing ministry, so different kinds of ministry things.
Yeah, they were some church planting, but a lot of education, teaching, literacy, because, if you want to read the Bible, you have to have a little literacy. And so those things standardly go together. And, of course, women and children at that time were not being educated. And so trying to reach the next generation, which I think the church is still trying to do, figure out how do we teach the next generation how to be Christians. And so I sort of grew up in that. And of course, being a time of violence, sort of like the Rwanda massacre kind of thing, only 250,000 people killed instead of 1 million. But still in all, in the middle of all of this, how do we live like Christians?
Yeah.
And so, then eventually I got a degree and ended up working with Jane Willard and Dallas Willard. Yep. And he always used how well we love our enemies as the benchmark of Christian maturity. And in fact, that was where my life started. We're reaching the people who are trying to kill us. And it's all about loving your enemies, and watching people do that sort of formed my idea of a Christianity that really changes people. And if it's not changing people, there must be something wrong with the way we're doing it.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So say more about that, because to get more of your story.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you were raised in church. So was church like a positive, encouraging experience for you? You're like, yeah, this is like a great way to grow up, or many people have to sort of sort that out as they get older in their life. I mean, how did you experience that?
Well, for one thing, it was sort of a mixed thing, like it is for everybody.
Sure.
On the one hand, they were locking us inside of our churches and lighting the churches on fire and, burning everyone to death inside. And so it seemed to me like Christianity would have to be something worth dying for, or it wasn't worth doing. So right to begin with, it's like, this is serious business. We got to see serious results.
Yeah.
And then you'd go and talk to the people who are trying to kill you, essentially, and tell them about this life with Jesus. And as soon as they became Christians, they had to come and join our community or they'd be killed where they are. And so you have, right there, you begin to see a pretty big transition in people's lives. Like, how do you go from one side to another and then grow in all of that? And because you had to flee your home, you had to take people into somebody else's home. So all of a sudden, you're living together in a community and stuff like that. And all of that really impressed me. It's like, this is serious stuff about really serious stuff. And on the other hand, most of the missionaries I grew up with were, the polite word for now would be dysfunctional. And so
that's it. If that's the polite word, I don't want to know what the bad word is.
Yeah. So you say, how come you can see such huge changes in some ways, and then sometimes you see things that just don't change at all, and they should, like we had one missionary who had a terrible temper problem. And, in some of the schools I was in, we were, physically abused and stuff like that. And so you go, wait a minute now, here we've got God doing some things. And then there's some leaders that just, they're one way on the outside, different way on the inside. This isn't right. And, and then I start wondering about my own life and why am I not changed about some things, after years and years and years? So I start wondering, does this God really work for me?
Yeah.
I think the one way to put it is, I grew up being taught about God, so I thought I understood him. But that made a God that was smaller than me, because everything about it made sense. Yeah. And at some point I had to get rid of that God and find one that was bigger than the one I had grown up thinking about. And when that happened, basically, God began to do things I didn't think God could do. Like talk to me, heal people, move things around, chase away demons, all these kind of stuff. Like, whoa, there's action in here. This, there's power in what we're talking about. And so I had to go around that bend myself.
Oh, wow. And just to hear how you were raised, I mean, when church is life and death, literally. Yeah.
Yes.
And the way you said that, this better be worth it. And we better see results. Okay. So that isn't necessarily the way, at least in the U.S., most people raise up. They're like, I don't know, this is kind of what my parents do. And it seems helpful in this or that way, but whatever. It's just sort of the life I'm living. But when the price tag's that high, it does sort of bring a different level of commitment pretty early. So
it's a interesting balance point right there. Like, God isn't just my assistant to make my life a little better and more comfortable, and I get better results with, me plus God. It's like, no, it's all on the line. And if God isn't there for me, it's like, I'm joining his plan here, and I'm not sure where that's going to take me.
Yeah. No, that's powerful. Okay, so 16, now you're in the U.S., and you're graduating. What kind of kid were you? Did you play sports? Did you like books? Were you a musician? All of the above?
Oh, yeah, musician would have been it. Anything I like to do. In fact, I have been in a couple of bands, done a little touring. I had to give it up because ultimately I had no talent, but that...
Minor detail. Detail.
After a while, if you looked around here, you'd still find 6 guitars and a bass.
Great.
That's good. In the basement with me. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Love to climb trees, ride bicycles, and do stuff like that.
Cool.
My brother was the intellectual.
Okay.
He was reading Shakespeare when he's, third grade or something like that. And
Wow.
it's like, no, I'll climb a tree. Thanks. That's
Yeah. Well, but hey, now I know what you do. So if he's the academic,
he is.
You're not exactly a slouch. So I can't imagine what kind of academic he is. So he's going to be a pretty impressive guy. I mean,
that is true. He's read 3 books so far this year to my not having finished one, so, and he was here to visit me a couple of weeks ago, and I spent hours listening to him to understand his points,
Wow.
I was a family dummy.
Oh, that's terrifying. That's a terrifying thought. Okay. So you're doing some music, want to be in a band, and as you're graduating high school, you head off to university, I assume. And what are your dreams? You're thinking, this is what I'm going to be in my life. I'm going to be a rock star. What were you thinking you'll be as you head off?
Well, the thing that really fascinated me always was rare diseases in medicine. So by the time I was 12, I had my own microscope, and I'm doing, studying everything that's in pond water and in the tropics. And there's a lot of stuff in pond water in the tropics, and doing that kind of science. So I thought I'd be a medical doctor probably, because that sort of appealed to me. But I was interested in the diseases that no one could treat. That was the whole thing. And so before I went to school, to college, it was like, well, you know what? I ought to get a year of Bible school because I know that I'm going secular universities and they don't believe in the Bible. And I was raised with this stuff, but I'm not sure, I'm quite ready to handle the whole intellectual world. So during that Bible school time, I had a crisis of faith. That's when I'm like, okay, why is this not working well? And I was looking at different people who are, they're in the school or teaching, and I'm going, you know what? Their teaching sounds good, but it doesn't quite match what they're doing. And, why, again, back to this, why isn't this working better around here? So it was actually an all night of prayer. And they asked me to lead the all-night of prayer for missionaries, the missionary hour, because, having grown up with that experience,
Sure. Yeah.
I thought, I can't believe this stuff. I'm not going to do it. So I went to bed instead. I woke up just before the hour, and I was in a cold sweat. It's like, wait a minute. If I give up this Christianity, I give up all my people. I don't know anybody, It's like, so you just have to fake it.
No. Yeah. This is terrible.
It was awful, just awful. So I went into the prayer hour, and I faked that whole hour the hardest and strongest and the worst I could, It's like, and everyone's in tears, and they're going, man, the Holy Spirit's really in here. And I want to slap them all because, I am totally making this stuff right up, left and right. And but it felt so terrible that I thought to myself, kind of by the end of the night, wait a minute, if there is a God, and everything I've been raised with, and I didn't mention to you, I had a stroke when I was 2. And everybody else who had the disease that caused my stroke died. And so I lived, and I was supposed to be in a wheelchair and probably not educatable, which is, part of how I came to be the family dummy. But here I am, going to school and walking and doing stuff on my own, and I'm alive. And so, wait a minute, if there's a purpose to all of this, and God got me here, I'd be the dumbest person in the world to not find out what it is. Yeah. So I'm just going to go back to the New Testament, see what it says, and I'm going to do that. And if it works, I'm in, all in. That's it. And if it doesn't work, I'm out. I'll go find something else. Yeah. And that is when God started talking to me directly. I could hear a voice. I knew if you had a recorder, you wouldn't have recorded anything, but I could hear this voice talking to me. And that continued for about 3 months. And sort of at the end of that time, I was working in a summer camp, and there was a lady there that was in a post-traumatic stress reaction. She was in a fetal position, all curled up, nonverbal and stuff like that. And I just walked in and I saw it. I had no idea what to do. And I said, Jesus, help. And she opened her eyes, stood up, and it resolved the entire trauma, which I didn't even know that was there. But it's like, wait a minute. Something happened here. I got to study what this is. I got to find out. So I dropped the medicine. I dropped all that stuff, started religious studies minor and a psychology major.
Oh, okay.
And then it was like, okay, I got to figure out how this is all working. And the psychology major really helped me figure out what went wrong. How did she end up in a fetal position? But not a thing about how Jesus helped made a difference. And the religious studies major, which had all the different religions of the world, indicated to me pretty clearly that none of them had the answer to all of this why Jesus helped work. That had to specifically be something Christian.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I know how but in this, I'm still waiting for it, And then I went to Fuller just after the whole Wimber and all those other things that were happening. And in the middle of this context is where I met the Willards. And that's where I found out how the Jesus Help solution came
You're
in.
like, wait a minute. So really what you're saying is you'd found something that worked, so to speak, and now you're fishing around for why did that work?
Exactly.
What was that? And it must have been something, and there must be a Jesus bit and there's a psychological bit.
Yep.
There's got to be some way these things fit together. So you're fishing around.
No one could tell me what it was.
Huh. Yeah. That's so interesting. Okay. So then you bump into the Willards, which I'm knowing some of your story is hugely influential. So describe a little bit of that. What started to connect the dots as you got to know
My
that?
first supervisor of any consequence was Jane Willard. And so she's has her degree in counseling, and she's training me how to be a counselor. And one day she says, I don't know if I should be telling you this because you're a psychologist and all, but down at my end of the hall, we're inviting Jesus in and asking him to help, and we're watching people's lives get changed. And you should have seen my eyes then. I'd love to have a picture of what it looked like. For years, I've been looking for where that is. What do you mean you don't know if you're going to tell me or not?
That's so great. So all of a sudden you're like, oh, other people are doing that thing.
Yeah. They're seeing it too, and it's happening in the same building, and no one's letting me know,
Well, because to people who maybe would have been from a more scientific or psychological school, that is too simplistic. It's too kind of ignorant or uninformed, right? I mean, that's probably what she's concerned about. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell you this because you're from a different school, but
this isn't professional training as we understand professional training.
Right.
But if you want to understand how do people change, then you better have a look at some of these things that are really making people change.
Yes.
And so the Willards were going to this church across the street. It was a Vineyard church. And they were letting him do a little speaking over there. Now, of course, when I met him, he wasn't the great Dr. Dallas Willard. He was a Dr. Dallas Willard, but he's a philosophy professor. Yeah. And he hadn't written his first books yet. And so it was like he was a little bit of unknown, except inside this Vineyard community that's like, oh, hey, we hit on some here. This guy talks about stuff that I've not heard anyone else talk about, And when he gets through explaining things, you go, wow, I never even thought that way before, So he was getting these amazing changes through spiritual ways over there in the Vineyard, except for some people that didn't get it and it wouldn't work for them. And we were getting some amazing changes on our counseling side of the street, except for some people it didn't work for them. And so we're sort of putting this together. Now, why is it that the spiritual side doesn't work very well for some people and amazing results for others? And why is it that the counseling side doesn't work very well for some people and amazing results for others? And it was in the context of trying to put those two things together, the two sides of the street, that we really started figuring out, how does the brain fit into the whole business with the spirit? What has to happen inside your brain so it can learn something new? What has to happen inside your spirit so it'll be something new to learn?
Yeah.
And how does the whole community fit into that? And so for about 20 years there, we're working together, trying to put together the pieces of this puzzle and watch how it happened. It's, it's one of those things you couldn't have created if you wanted to, just on your own, but like God putting all these perspectives together. And people would call our counseling center and say, I don't know who you are, but God has given me a piece of a puzzle, and he says I should call you and talk with you. It's like, well, yeah, we're trying to put together a puzzle here. So you've called the right place. Who are you and what's your piece,
Wow.
It was clearly being put together by a much higher hand than us.
Wow. Man, that's encouraging. So at this point, you're a clinical psychologist. You're running a clinic, or you're doing... Well, what kinds of things are you doing? What's your vocation?
Yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, and, I have at that point, I had a master's in theology, so I had that background, and trying to put together the thoughts, but not finding a lot useful quite yet from that side,
Right.
So it's, and I was thinking, I'm going to work with missionaries. So, for 10 years, I'd been saying, I'm going to work with missionaries. Not one came to see me. There was just nothing. And so I knew a group that did work with missionaries, and the lady's house burned down. Every book she had on missions burned up. So I said, no missionaries come to see me. I'm just going to give you my entire library. I've given it up. No more working with missionaries. What God is sending me is all these trauma victims. And so we became one of the leading trauma care clinics in the world. It was interesting that by 3 months later, I looked at my caseload. 2/3 of them were missionaries who were there for trauma. So it's like, again, you just feel like some days God is just messing with you. Like,
yeah, totally.
Well, are you ready to do it my way yet? Like, okay, I give up. All right, what is your way?
That's so great. Okay, so you're doing clinical work with mostly trauma victims, and they're finding you just through their health insurance or through a church or through your friendships.
We were serving about 200 churches in the San Fernando Valley at that time in Los Angeles. And so the word of mouth was getting out really fast. And because we were working with a lot of church leaders, they spread the word to other church leaders. And, at that point, now everybody talks about trauma, but at that point, they were just trying to figure out what is a definition of trauma. It's like it was very, very early in the game.
Yeah.
So we were pretty much the only game in town or on the globe at that point.
Wow. So say more about that, because, from your psychological training, you've been probably taught a series of ways to understand people that are coming into your office, but then you start to develop some new thoughts like, well, wait a minute, we're noticing some different kinds of things about their neurology or how this is affecting their body or what it would mean spiritually for them to address this, not just in sort of the classic psychological training. So talk a little bit about how your thinking starts to change, or what were some of the pivot points?
Yeah, I think the best way you could describe it is sort of groping around in the dark. We tried everything. I mean, I don't even want to go down a list of all the things that we tried. And it's like, okay, we tried that. Everybody got hospitalized. All right. That's
that
not
didn't
the
work.
best plan right there. We tried something out. Every one of our counselors developed secondary post-traumatic stress. Like,
wow. Yeah.
Okay, that didn't work. We just, fried 18 counselors,
Wow. That's
not so badly that we couldn't bring them back, but, it got to the point like, do I really want to go to work? Kind of thing. And the interesting thing is right about that time, a book on deliverance came out. It wasn't just about deliverance, but about evil. And the whole deliverance, spiritual warfare movement was just getting started. And it turns out that there's like a symptom list of if you were demonized or not that got into circulation by some of these groups that were working together, one up in Los Gatos particularly. And we had a list of trauma symptoms. And so we compared them, and aside from 2 or 3 items out of maybe 20, they were all the same.
Wow.
So we went, oh, hey, wait a minute here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Scott Peck was the one who had written the book on evil.
Oh, yeah,
And-
People to Lie. I know that.
People, yeah,
Exceptional book. Yeah.
So he invited us to participate with his groups, and he invited all the deliverance people to participate, and all of a sudden we're in the same pool.
Wow.
And my boss sent me up there to Los Gatos. He said, I want you to explain to them that it isn't about demons, it's all about trauma. And I wasn't sure I wanted the job, but, he told me to go.
I'll give it a shot. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. He said, but be careful for this one guy up there, this little guy, Ed Murphy from Biola. He said, he's real hard to deal with, whatever like that. So I went up there, and who should be the first speaker but Ed Murphy? And I thought, he's talking about, how I discovered demonic stuff was when I was a missionary in Cali, Colombia. And I walk into my daughter's room, and there she is 3 feet off of the bed, kind of floating in the air. And I said, they didn't tell me about this in seminary.
Yeah, exactly.
So I got to figure this out. And I went, wait a minute. Ed Murphy from Cali, Colombia, which is 15 kilometers from where I grew up, says, there was an hermano Eduardo Murphy that lived over there. Could this be the same guy,
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so I walked up with him afterwards, and I said, are you the hermano Eduardo Murphy from Cali? And he looked at me, he says, you're Myrtle and Earl's kid, aren't you?
Oh.
And from that point on, it's like, well, why are you here? So I bring messages, right?
Yeah, right.
So he said, well, we're way too busy because it's a conference, but there's a meeting at the end of the conference. All the speakers will be there. Why don't you come and tell us all? And so, when I went there, what I felt God had told me to tell them was, all of these symptoms that overlap are simple symptoms of a wounded person. There's just a few that can tell you whether demonic irritation is in there on top of the wound, and whether it's trauma symptoms on top of the wound. But we really got to deal with both at once.
Yeah.
And that began, sort of the unfolding of it, where the spiritual warfare, and pretty soon the addiction recovery people and all these people are sort of like, we've got to get on the same page here and find out how people change, and why some people get help that makes them change, and another person get the same help and it won't work. And so now you remember I wanted to work on problems that no one had been able to solve.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right.
This is I am so on this, wow, this is what I have all my life wanted to do. Figure out something that won't work. And so I was on top of Mount Langley with a youth group, and it's the second highest peak in the 48 states. And I had a PhD at that point, and they're like, here's a kid's not supposed to get out of a wheelchair and not supposed to be able to get an education. I'm top of Langley, got here by myself, and I've got a PhD. If God can do that, he can give me the answer for the people no one can help. Wow. And that was my prayer up there. And that's when we discovered the brain science. About a month later, this brochure arrives with all the brain science, and that's another fun story. But it's one of those things that's like, we had no idea this was here. God brought it in, and all of a sudden, like, okay, there's some things that have to be done in the brain. There's some things that have to be done in the spirit. Some people might need one first. Some people might need the others first. Some might need the combination, and the only one knows how to weave that together is God. So if you follow his guidance, you'll know which one does you need now.
Yeah.
And following that path, all of a sudden you have people changing and sustaining their change. Because we would get people that would change, but by the end of the week they were back in the same mess they were in before, right?
Right.
But walking people through that, explained to people on the Vineyard side of the street They had the spiritual stuff going, but the things that had to happen in their brain to teach you something new weren't happening. We had people who were teaching them something new, but the spiritual side might not be as strong. But the other thing we found was that it needed a fellowship group that sort of resembled a family. Because your family almost always had been the one that messed you up.
Right.
And you needed somebody else to sort of, let's say, practice with.
Yeah.
So somebody who knew a little bit more about how to be mature, how to be human, how to be Christian, how, had learned, done that for a little while, needed to be ahead of you and show you how to actually live this out, let you practice on them, you might say. Yeah. And when that happened, the context, the church context, the spiritual context, and what you actually had to learn and heal come together, all of a sudden you have not just a person who's changing, but a community that's changing. And that is what we were looking for.
Yeah. Okay. So you're talking mostly to Vineyard folks or friends that are friends of the Vineyard. And so you said it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, like have to talk to people on the Vineyard side of the street to think about brain science. So and you've written extensively about this, so we'll put in the show notes a bunch of books and resources, work that you've done. So I'm asking you to summarize, thousands of pages you've written. But if you were to talk to, Vineyard folks, you say, man, here's the thing that you guys offer that's so useful and powerful. Like, don't let your foot off the pedal. But you would also want to say, here's some things for you to consider. Here's some things that might be in your training, or maybe you haven't thought about as you think about being in church or leading a church. How would you want to speak to Vineyard folk?
Yeah, the thing I would say about Vineyard, going back in the history, because now we're going back, 40 years or something like that, right? They were almost all the same age group.
Yeah.
And so just like there's a bunch of these young adult, 30, let's just say, sort of the middle-ish part of the group, right? No one had more experience than anyone else. And there's some things you just need more mature people to do. Yeah. And the Vineyard at that point had a tendency to wait for the Holy Spirit to do everything. And so the idea that we need somebody, a person who can actually teach us something, that didn't fit with impartation all that well. We can impart the Spirit, but do we actually form relationships in which we learn something from someone more mature than us? And at that point, there's quite a few. I remember one time doing a retreat with a particular Vineyard church, and halfway through the retreat, the pastor said, I'm leaving. I'm going home to tell my family why it is that we're having such a hard time at home. And that's because I've been trying to do work that I don't have the maturity to handle. And so it's taking me away from my family and the things that we care about, because I've sort of thought, since I'm the pastor, I should be able to do all of these, very complicated relational problems. And it's just draining me. So I come home with no joy and stuff like that. So I'm going to let some other people in the church carry some of this load that are more mature than I am. And it was sort of those kind of discoveries being made as we're going along. There's some things that are really the wrong time to try to do them. Then there's, we'd go to another church where the human beings were doing everything. It's like we're all relationship here. We're all effort. We're all in. But the Holy Spirit never came invited to, to either get rid of what's evil, or to actually give you the power to see something more than you were seeing before. So, one of the things about the brain, for instance, is your identity center is unable to see itself. It's a mirror neuron. I can only see myself by looking at you and seeing what are you seeing in me?
Interesting, yeah.
Right? Okay. So if you've got no one to look at you and see what God sees in you, there's no way your brain can grow what God wants to grow in you and get any practice at it. Sometimes God can reveal that You see, and so it's like I had this vision of myself being this and this and this, but I can't seem to get there because no one around me can see that in me and help it to grow. So that, it really requires this divine vision of more than we could ever see or know. A word and a vision and a knowledge and all of that goes beyond human understanding, or we don't get any better than the average human.
Right.
And at the same time, we need some people that are about equally bad at it as we are to practice with,
Right.
You put those two things together and some pretty marvelous things can begin to grow and become sustainable.
If you're interested in more of the work Vineyard USA is doing to promote healthy pastors and leaders, we'd encourage you to check out the Pastoral Health Information page on our website. Go to vineyardusa.org/pastoral health to learn about resources, upcoming cohorts, and support from the Vineyard USA team.
Help us think a little bit about leaders themselves. So leaders place themselves, you just gave a great illustration. This leader suddenly has a realization. I don't think I'm mature enough to do what I'm doing at the rate I'm doing it. And I think that leaders have that realization, but probably not that eloquently. They feel themselves getting tired. They feel themselves getting irritated. They feel themselves becoming hopeless, or maybe they notice themselves powering up. Like, why am I getting so aggressive? I don't like this about myself, or I don't think I'm an aggressive person. But in this context, suddenly I'm powering up, or I want to just go take a nap, or I'm thinking about quitting. I'm thinking about real estate. It's like some ridiculous number of pastors I hang out with are thinking about real estate these days. So what do you think are the unique challenges within what you're describing with specifically those who say they're going to lead in church or be pastors? What would you want to say to them?
Well, I'd probably throw together about 3 different elements to sort of start with. The first is there's one part of the church that thinks that your education, training, and all of that's going to equip you to do the pastoral business. And so if you're well-trained, if you got good degrees, if I was to waltz in someplace, I've got a master's degree and a PhD and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of denominations. In fact, the one that I'm ordained with ordained me for little other reason than that.
That's great.
But that isn't maturity.
Yeah.
Right. Maturity is really built with my capacity to handle all the stuff that today throws at me. And stay the person God meant me to be. So it's like, I have such a good idea who I am that it doesn't really matter what you do to me. It isn't going to change. I remember one particular pastor from, I think it was Romania, back in the Soviet era. The Soviet soldiers came into his house and started going through his library and finding all the stuff they're going to use to convict him. And he's getting afraid. And then he thought to himself, I've forgotten who I am. I'm a pastor and I care about these people, so I should offer them tea. He knew they were going to carry him off to prison and torture him. But it's like, would you like some tea? And, let's offer them some hospitality. That remembering who you are under pressure is maturity. And so no amount of education really gets you to maturity. I won't neglect education. There's a lot of things that are useful to know, but the other side of the church looks at anointing, and there's people with very, very powerful anointings. They also don't have maturity to go with it. I remember actually being one time done at the Anaheim Vineyard, and I won't be more specific than that, but I remember one person who would prophesy. And when they prophesied, it was like the sweet nectar of heaven. But as soon as they would start to explain it, every bit of their immaturity would show up, and I would oh man, he shouldn't really talk. Prophesy, yes, but don't explain what you're talking about.
Totally.
And the thing about maturity is it can be grown 2 ways. and be grown based on fear, I can do a lot of things because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't do them. So it's an obligation, it's a work, it's an effort. Like, well, if I don't go and take care of the sick person, who's going to take care of them? So I'm going to go and do it. But what happens is your joy drains out.
Yeah.
And so what maturity does is if you're ready to be a father, right, and your baby keeps you up all night, you don't enjoy being up all night, but you feel very fatherly about having done it. Like, I know I'm a dad because I was up all night with this kid screaming in my ear and spitting up on me, and he didn't care one way or another. But, these are the things that dads do, and I'm proud of it,
Right. Yep.
If you don't have the maturity, you resent the kid keeping you up all night, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, the burden of the church becomes a resentment and an exhaustion as opposed to a joy, particularly if your younger children are under the age of 12, because by 13, they're sort of able to take care of themselves. And so these are some of the ways in which a lot of pastors feel like, I should be able to handle this. I've got the anointing. I should be able to handle this. I have the edge. But the third pressure is that our culture is a high performance culture.
Right.
And so the expectation from almost everyone that walks in the church is, you better be performing at a higher level than the last church I visited, or I'm not going to hang out here. And so if you don't have some kind of solution to what do I do when people expect me to perform, which comes from maturity, the pressure to perform is so extreme that many people actually sort of become their performance. You ask them, well, who are you? Well, they can tell you what they perform. But if they say, well, go deeper, who are you in your heart? I'm not sure what you're talking about here.
Right.
And really the pastors that were getting in the most trouble were often high performers.
Yes.
And they had great anointings or great educations. They had all these things going on. But the performance had made them lose track of who they were in their heart. And the push to perform, of course, will make you always do things that you haven't got the maturity to do. And that's a really bad plan when your joy begins to drift. All of a sudden it's dropping. Now your family isn't ready to be with you. I remember talking to some pastors in Korea, and they got up at 4:00 in the morning to go into church to pray because this is a big thing. These are associate pastors in the church, and they would stay at church till midnight. So I said, wait a minute, how your family's doing? Oh, so no, we stay here till midnight because we want to make sure our family's asleep because they're all so angry at us. We don't want to hear about it when we get home. So we go home after they're asleep. We get up before they wake and we spend the rest of the day in the church. That is a low joy environment. Yeah. So now joy means someone's glad to be with me, right? So in this particular church, a woman came to the church who was really interested in high status pastors and wanted to let them know how special they were. And that ended badly.
I'm not surprised to hear it. Yeah,
because here's a low joy environment, people tired, and suddenly someone comes around who's really glad to see you. And I remember another person having nothing whatsoever to do with the Vineyard, but he was a supervisor for over 20,000 pastors in one part of the world. And one day I heard he had run off with some lady he'd met in the ministry, and I talked to him, and he said, well, she brings me more joy than my whole ministry did. I'm not leaving her. Wow. Now, he had no idea that joy had anything to do with it. He just sort of spontaneously gave me that as the reason why he did it. And so, but you get too tired, you get your joy down. The people who are expecting you're going to be glad to be with them are already annoyed with you, and now you've just set up all the conditions for an out of control fire if a spark was to come around.
That's right.
And I have yet to find a ministry failure that didn't involve low joy, doing something more than your maturity, and having a performance image that didn't match what was going on inside of you.
And what's terrifying about what you're describing is someone can be doing a good job.
Oh,
quote unquote,
fantastic. Yeah.
and have all the elements you're describing. So there's a chance, there's a percentage of people listening right now going, I don't know that anybody can see, but man, I am avoiding my family. Boy, I am really tired. Boy, I most of my focus is on, let me make sure this next Sunday works, or, what are some of the antidotes? What starts to move us out of this? How do we mend the soil, so to speak? What do you think are some first steps?
Well, that degree of awareness that you talked about there is certainly going to be quite helpful. Yeah. But I think the door that opens the easiest, it's an odd one, but most of the people, the pastors that we're talking about in that condition, I ask them, who's upstream from you? Do you have anybody that gives you life, or are you the last stop for humanity before they reach God?
That's a good way of asking it, because they know the right answer. I mean, they should be like, I know that's not true. It feels like that's true. But
they give me that dirty look, like,
right.
You've got some nerve asking me that question.
No, that's perfect. I love it. Yeah.
But really, I say, I will tell them, Paul writes to, and I'm forgetting who he wrote to. He said, but greet your mother, who's a mother to me also. And I said, if St. Paul needed a spiritual mother, what are the odds you don't?
Yeah.
And, God didn't intend for any of us to be the last stop before heaven, or to stay there for any length of time. And so I'm going, like, who's going to look after your life in your church? And if you don't have anybody, you're going to get crispy really fast. And if they're brave, I'll also ask them, are there any fears that are keeping you going? What would happen if you were to change, or you were to stop, or you were to slow down, or you were to perform a little bit less dramatically than you are now? What would happen? And they almost always have their fingers right on what those fears are. Well, if we back off this, if I back off this, and then we say, well, I wonder if Jesus is afraid of that. And if so, can we have a talk with him? Now we're talking about the spiritual side of things here. Does Jesus want you to be that? And then I'll ask, well, who are the sources of joy in your life? And is there any way that you could, my son is, I said, well, how many minutes with him do you have? Well, we probably 10 minutes a week.
Yeah.
So is there any way you could double that?
Right.
Right. Who are the people God put in your life, and how do you double the joy you have with them? Just deliberately. Let's rebuild the joy in the places where you are. And, every once in a while they run into somebody that I think they're too mad at me to build any joy. And now there's no fast or easy advice to that.
Right.
Except for, I can probably tell you something that won't make sense to some people. And that is, part of joy is being willing to be with people in their trouble. Yeah. Right? So I said, is there any way you think God might have made you a resource to this person who's mad at you? That you would just want to be with them in order to be whatever resource God wants you to be to them. And if we're going to be a resource to somebody who's mad at us, that's different than trying to figure out how to keep them from getting mad at us, right?
Yes, that's right.
Because that's never going to work.
Right. Right. No, that's good.
And so, again, let's open the door to Jesus coming in and showing us something he wants to do in the middle of all of that. Not everybody's willing to look at that for very long.
Totally. No, when I'm listening to you, I'm going, I'm hearing people trying to get out of that conversation more than get through it. Is there an exit out of this thing? This feels terrifying. Yeah, exactly. But if they can do that, if they have enough courage and strength or trust with you to be able to move through that, man, those are powerful reflection questions. Those are really powerful. Yeah.
And again, another way that I like to talk to pastors and leaders particularly about it is, you were sent into ministry because people needed it. And they go, oh, yes, of course. What did you come here for? So, well, I want to see people's lives changed. I said, okay, now let me just say one way that affects you. People in this culture are going to expect you to perform and to keep the image of the church up and looking really good. Now, is that actually what God sent us to do? And I've yet to have a pastor go, yeah, that's what it's all about. We're supposed to, no. Well, here's the thing that you probably were never taught in school or wherever else you went, and that is, how do you get people to change their performance expectation about pastors to match what God wants in all of us? Because we've got a culture that needs to be rescued from being all about performance. And this is a major task for the church.
Yes.
And the fact that it's going to be difficult should be no surprise to any of us. And the fact that the church is going to put that expectation on us all the time is, that's just how it's going to be. And every demonic force that will get behind that, like, if you're not performing, we're going to agitate these people until it won't stop, and so that's really the problem that we're up against. And would you like to pray into that? Would you like to read into that? Would you like to look into that?
Yeah.
And then one of the more radical things I say is that God never guides his children through fear. There's no example in Scripture of God guiding only his enemies does he guide through fear. And so if we've got fear guiding our lives, we're not being guided by God. And isn't that what we have to begin to pray into? Like, it's not up to us to solve our fears.
Yeah.
But John says in 1 John that a mature love, teleos love, it can be translated mature or complete or thorough love. And the word for love, of course, is agape there. Which also means attachment, which is a secure attachment to God. And then if you look at the verb, pumps the fear out of you. It casts out fear. It pumps it out. It's not like the fear is, not gone if you're mature. It's just, if you're mature, I'm connected with God. God is going to help me get this fear out of my life so it doesn't sink my boat. And don't you want to get into that lifestyle? And I haven't yet to find anybody who didn't want to get into that lifestyle.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
Okay, that's great. Now, who's going to encourage you? That becomes the next question. Whoever's upstream will encourage you.
Yes.
And usually, most times, your spouse will encourage you.
Right.
And your kids will encourage you, and you can begin to add to that list. Who are the people that are going to encourage you to do that? And once it becomes a process, we can live into this. We don't have to okay, now that I've had this insight, I'm going to make it all change. That doesn't work.
Right, exactly.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you got to build reps with a different way of living. Yeah, I hear that. Okay, so what do we do? How do we think about, and maybe we can try to land the plane here. How would we think about, like, it's already sort of destroyed? You think about people whose lives just get destroyed. They're out of ministry, or they've lost their marriage, or their kids won't talk to them, or now they've done things in such a way they've ruined their friendships. So the people that they would have put on the list have all said, I'm done with you. You've blown the bridge. How have you seen people repair at that point? Well, there's one critical problem that is probably much more than we can take on in this podcast. But it really has to do with how well you take correction, or what I would call a healthy shame message. And the people who are in the most trouble won't receive a healthy shame message from anybody. It's like no one can tell you, you're not being the person God meant you to be right now. Yeah.
And if you won't hear that from anybody, then you can't rebuild. And the reason that people get stuck there, it seems to perfectly match the fact that they only have a performance self.
Yeah.
So if you tell me I'm not doing it, you're asking for more performance out of me. And I'm already performing as hard as I can, and you see where I got me.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, I want to look into you and see who God is calling out, which is a healthy shame message. The way you're acting right now is less than God meant you to be.
Yeah.
And here's what I think God has in mind for you of who you really are. Again, we'll go back to the performance side. The church wants to get those people back into performing as quickly as possible.
Right.
That will destroy them for another round.
Yes.
I know that's controversial right there, but...
No, not to me it isn't. I think you're right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But I can think of a number of podcasts that wouldn't like to hear that.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, but I mean that restoration is restoring the human
right,
to being made
performance.
Yeah, in a life with God that's life-giving and attached. And
yes.
And then that will give them the capacity to repair relationships or maybe vocation. But if you try to put any of that performance stuff into the mix, it's all wired up wrong. There's no way to access what that person then. Yeah.
Yeah. And the faster you put a load on them, the faster it goes back to performance again. So the question is, can anyone actually see who God means you to be? And are you humble enough to say, I'm not that yet? And if you can stay in that zone where people have the right to say, you know what, you're back to performing again, aren't you? Oh, no, I'm not. Yeah, well, you've got that edge to you right now. Like, oh, I hate to say it, but yes, that's true. But that's, is Jesus mad at you for that? Let's go talk with him, So again, you have to keep Jesus in the mix because he's, I remember talking to one leader in South America one time, and we went, let's go talk to Jesus about what's going on right now. And he had been blowing up his whole ministry, but he didn't know it. And he walked up to me at the end of the time. He said, you're an American. He said, if you had come down and told me what I was doing, I would just fight you. But Jesus just told me that I've been a fool, and he did it without making me feel terrible about myself.
Yeah,
so I want to change that. So there's these things that, let's connect people with Jesus, go like, wait a minute, let's not make this about performance. Let's be humble. Let's stay connected with Jesus. And let's give that some time to grow. And the point that we find is that Jesus is not in a hurry to make us perform because he doesn't actually need us to be great to make him look good.
That's right.
And that peaceful way of living lets you rebuild the joy in your relationships. And people who've done that are really slow to get back into, picking up a load.
Yep.
But they're a blessing to the people that God's put in their lives. And so that's, kind of a real short answer to what we both know is an extremely complex situation.
Yeah, but that really helps.
If all you've had is your performance self, it feels like you've just been shot in the head and killed when you've been told that performance isn't what it's all about. Because there's nothing else that I know about me but my performance. Yeah. So now nobody wants me. You see how it's going to add up.
Yeah.
It's like, we have to be able to see, and this is where the vineyard comes in, this idea that God has given us eyes and ears and mouth to say to other people what he sees in them that they can't see in the moment and they can't see in themselves. And when the community gathers around you and like, you see the same thing and you see the same, and you see, and we are going to stay here until I get a chance to grow. Now you have a chance to actually outgrow your performance. And of course, that isn't what culture will want you to do.
Yes.
So that's kind of my short answer. And it's a marvelous discussion that I hope a lot of pastors can begin to have with somebody they trust.
Amen. No, and I appreciate you pushing people toward people because that one insight you gave that you can't see your own consciousness, you're unable to. You have to look at other people who reflect something to you. That is that in and of itself is a powerful tool. It means you have to trust them. It means they have to actually be the kind of people that can do that. It helps if they're older or more mature. I hear all those things. Those are really helpful thoughts. Yeah.
And they have to have some degree of commitment to you, or it doesn't soak in. It's like, okay, well, everyone's got an opinion about me, but who are you to me? It's the brain has that general attitude, like, well, you don't care about me, I don't care about your opinion. So
that's so good. Yeah. Well, I've taken a ton of your time. So I
really appreciate you having me on your podcast here with all that time. Oh my
goodness. No, I would love all the time you will give me, because I'm so grateful for your work. We're going to put, like I said in the show notes, we'll put a whole bunch of books people should read. I've gotten to be friends Michael Sullivan here and there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful leader, great guy. Michael Hendricks, of course, the other half church. So many people are helping to work out some of the principles you've laid out. And
so this will sound like it's very self-serving, but don't buy one book, get 3, and give 2 to 2 friends, and the 3 of you discuss them,
That's right. So you're modeling what you described. Yeah, working with people. Yeah,
that's where it actually makes a change, when there's like 3 of us are going at this together.
Yeah.
There's something that adds. 2 or 3 gathered together is got all kinds of properties to it. So I recommend finding somebody to do it with you.
That's great. Well, it's really good. Well, hopefully we get some more time to hang out in the future. I would love that if it was possible. I'm so grateful for your work, and I'm really encouraged you get a chance to speak into our movement, given that you have been in the Vineyard and around the Vineyard forever. I mean,
it's shaped me, and I'm glad to do a little contribution back to the fires that forged me, along the way. So, yes, thank you, Jay. I appreciate being with you.
Yeah, I'm grateful.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.